It was late 2013 when a biker club based in Detroit, together with a partner street gang, began plotting to wipe out an entire rival club. The plan was so detailed that it had phases of execution. The first phase was to kill the rivals in Detroit. The second phase was to take out anyone who showed up at their funeral. And the third phase was to hunt down the rest of the members in every city where they wore the patch.
With wiretaps, surveillance, and snitches, they say they moved in just in time, stopping 3 planned murders.
But before the plan could go live, federal agents moved in. So the question was, how did the feds know what was coming? Or did someone inside the club start cooperating with the authorities? Which leaves us with the real mystery. What pushed the club this close to mass bloodshed? To understand how this plot became possible, you first need to understand who we're talking about: the Phantom Outlaw Motorcycle Club and their street gang partner, the Vice Lords, Phantom MC. To understand how this plot became possible, you first need to understand the structure of the Phantom Outlaw Motorcycle Club and the network that stood behind it. The Phantom Outlaw Motorcycle Club operated with a formal hierarchy. At the national level, they had a president, vice president, treasurer, and enforcers. Each local chapter had its own president and vice president, with the Detroit chapter recognized as the mother chapter. One of the members connected to these internal dynamics was Dwayne Sorrell, who belonged to the Inkster, Michigan chapter. The club maintained a reputation for being one of the toughest organizations in the Detroit motorcycle world. Part of that image came from a practice that appeared repeatedly in federal records, taking leather vests, or rags, from rival clubs as a show of dominance. What distinguished the Phantoms from many other regional motorcycle groups was their connection to the Vice Lords, one of the most established street gangs in the Midwest. Their national leader, Antonio Johnson, known as Mr. Tony, or Big Bro, held the Vice Lords rank of 3-star general, the highest standing in Michigan. His influence in both groups gave the Phantoms access to people, territory, and support that most local biker clubs did not possess. Several of the club's central figures also had ties to both networks. Marvin Nicholson, known as Chosen One, functioned as one of Johnson's closest associates and later appeared in federal indictments as a key enforcer. Another longtime member, Stephen Shoes Boots Caldwell, held a leadership role within the Phantoms and was well regarded inside the club. He too had connections to the Vice Lords. Carl Fats Miller served as the president of the Detroit chapter during this period. These combined roles, biker hierarchy mixed with individuals who held influence in the Vice Lords, meant the Phantoms entered conflicts with organizational depth that went beyond a typical motorcycle club. Antonio M.T. Johnson. Antonio M.T. Johnson was the central figure shaping the club's direction during this period. His influence stood out because he held standing in both the Phantom Outlaw Motorcycle Club and the Vice Lords in Michigan. That overlap gave him reach across 2 separate criminal networks, and as a result, his assessments carried immediate weight inside the Phantoms. Due to his influence in Phantoms and Vice Lords, MT had access to people, resources, and information beyond what most regional motorcycle club leaders could command. Under his leadership, the Phantoms operated with a blended structure, outwardly a motorcycle club, but supported by additional manpower and street-level connections that came from MT's Vice Lords ties. This hybrid setup allowed the group to mobilize more quickly and coordinate across multiple neighborhoods and chapters in ways that were unusual for a club of their size. Because of this dual network influence, MT's views shaped the Phantom's internal decisions in ways that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. Without his outside connections, the Phantoms might have treated disputes as localized issues. With him, conflicts expanded in scale and seriousness. Several other key figures helped shape the club's response during this period, each holding roles that bridged the biker hierarchy and the Vice Lords network. Marvin, Chosen One. Nicholson served as the national enforcer of the Phantoms and was also a Vice Lords member. Known to be close to MT, he functioned as one of his primary enforcers. Brian P.C. Sorrell, a Detroit chapter member with Vice Lords ties, was part of the circle involved in internal discussions and operational planning. Sherman Tank Brown, the sergeant-at-arms of the Detroit chapter, handled enforcement responsibilities and internal discipline. Brian Wood Jackson, Master Sergeant of the Inkster chapter, played a role in coordinating movement and communication between multiple Phantom locations. Matthew Arsenal Chalmonte, President of the Pontiac chapter, added another layer of leadership to the group's multi-chapter structure. This leadership network was already in place, and when troubles surfaced, it shifted the Phantoms from ordinary tension into active conflict almost immediately. The first spark didn't come from a major attack or a fatal shooting. It started with something far more common in outlaw club culture: stealing vests. In motorcycle clubs, a member's vest, often called a rag, is more than leather. It's identity, rank, and loyalty, stitched into one symbol. Taking another club's rag is a direct challenge, a way of asserting dominance without firing a shot. For years, the Phantoms had used this tactic against rival groups, and in late 2013, one of those confrontations escalated far beyond what anyone expected. In September 2013, this practice played a role in escalating tensions around the Phantoms. During this period, a group of Phantoms that included Brian P.C. Sorrell, Carl Fats Miller, the Detroit chapter president, Valdez, and a club prospect set out to confront members of the Satan's Sidekicks Motorcycle Club. Their goal was to seize Sidekicks vests, a move consistent with how the Phantoms often asserted presence in the local biker landscape. The group drove to the Soul Devils clubhouse, where they believed they would encounter Sidekicks members. Several of the men, including Sorrell, were armed, a typical precaution for a mission like this. They waited in the parking lot for nearly an hour until Leon McGee, a Sidekicks member, emerged with his wife, Antoinette. Sorrell identified McGee as a target, and Valdez approached him as he was opening the passenger door for Antoinette. Valdez threw the first punch, which had little effect. Sorrell moved in to assist, but McGee struck him several times, knocking him down. The situation escalated quickly. The prospect and Miller rushed toward McGee, who told his wife to retrieve her pistol from her purse and let them have it. As McGee attempted to retreat into the driver's seat of his SUV, Valdez moved behind the vehicle and then to the passenger side window. From there, he saw Sorrell point a gun into the vehicle and fire. McGee was hit. Valdez fired a single shot into the air, but his weapon jammed before he could fire again. By that point, the scene had collapsed into confusion, and the men fled. In the confrontation, Sorrell was stabbed and shot, and McGee was also shot. The violence immediately drew law enforcement attention. What began as an attempt to steal rags had become another serious incident attached to the Phantoms during a turbulent stretch of 2013. A couple of days later, the Phantoms held a meeting to discuss the failed mission. When Valdez arrived, he walked into a room filled with tension. MT was blaming Miller for how the event unfolded. No rags were taken, Sorrell had been injured, and Miller was directing blame at Valdez. Feeling cornered, Valdez told the group he had shot McGee in the face. Later, he admitted that wasn't true. He said he claimed responsibility in the moment because he believed that if he didn't, something was going to happen to him inside that meeting. The rag robbery shooting didn't occur in isolation. Earlier that same month, a far more serious incident had already pushed the Phantoms toward escalation. Phantom members Stephen Shoe Boots Caldwell and Andre He-Man Swift were attacked in a drive-by shooting in Detroit. Caldwell later died from his injuries, and within the club, it was widely believed that the Hell Lovers were responsible. When MT identified the Hell Lovers as the likely source, directly or indirectly, the Phantoms accepted that conclusion without debate. His assessment set the direction of the conflict. With MT's influence, supported by ties to both a motorcycle club and the Vice Lords, the group now had the structure to coordinate a response far more organized than what most regional clubs could manage. By the time the rag robbery incident unfolded, the Phantoms were already operating under the belief that multiple rivals were pressing against them. The death of Caldwell and the violent confrontation over the stolen vests reinforced the same internal message, that symbolic tensions had transitioned into real, sustained conflict. This was the environment in which the next stage of the story took shape, the moment when broad, emotional conversations inside the Phantoms narrowed into a structured, multi-phase plan. By this point, tensions were no longer confined to symbolic gestures or minor fights. Violence was becoming the pattern, and the group's leadership, already empowered by ties to the vice lords, was preparing to respond on a larger scale. The internal mood shifted from frustration to escalation, and federal investigators watching from the outside began to see the Phantoms not as a regional nuisance, but as a crew moving steadily toward organized retaliatory violence. Snitches. As the violence escalated, attention from law enforcement intensified as well. And when pressure builds, the weakest points in any organization tend to crack first. Inside the Phantoms, that break came from within. 2 members connected to the rag robbery incident later became central to the federal investigation. Both men faced significant legal exposure, and cooperation offered a chance to reduce potential penalties, an option that becomes difficult to ignore when the alternative is decades in federal prison. Roger June Valdez, who was incarcerated by the time the case went to trial, agreed to work with authorities and provided detailed testimony about the Phantoms' internal operations and the events leading up to the planned attacks. Around the same period, Carl Fats Miller, the Detroit chapter president, also chose to cooperate. He began wearing a recording device during conversations with other members, capturing discussions that helped investigators map out the Phantoms' planning, hierarchy, and intentions. Miller's decision didn't come out of nowhere. Less than a year earlier, in June 2012, he had been ordered to retrieve the vest of a former Phantom known as Dirty Red. Miller tried to follow the order but walked into a setup. He was shot in the stomach and spent more than a month in a coma. What bothered him afterward wasn't only the attack itself, it was the club's response. No one retaliated against Dirty Red, and the mission to recover the vest was quietly abandoned once Miller was hospitalized. The incident left him questioning his standing inside the club and the loyalty he believed he had earned. By late 2013, with federal charges closing in and the possibility of decades in prison becoming real, Miller saw a way to negotiate a lighter outcome. Cooperation offered a path forward that the club could not, and once he agreed, the recordings he captured became a major turning point in the investigation. Their recordings and statements would later form a key part of the foundation for the government's case, and explain how investigators were able to intervene before the larger plot unfolded. Gearing up for war. On the other side of the investigation, the Phantoms were preparing for conflict. The rag robbery incident didn't slow the group down. It reinforced the internal belief that tensions with rivals were escalating and that a response was inevitable. MT emphasized structure and timing rather than spontaneous violence. Members began quietly monitoring locations connected to the Hell Lovers, clubhouses, homes, meeting spots, and areas where they routinely gathered. These weren't confrontational visits. What stood out during this period was not just the planning, but the level of coordination behind it. Members followed the internal structure already shaped by his dual influence in the Phantoms and the Vice Lords. Instructions were given quietly and directly, without the performance or dramatics often associated with club confrontations. Meanwhile, federal authorities were tracking the developments closely. Investigators monitored calls, reviewed recordings, watched movements, and reconstructed the sequence of decisions as it progressed. The cooperating witness inside the club was not providing isolated comments. He was documenting the order of events, the discussions behind the assignments, and the structure of the plan. That combination of intent and organization signaled to agents that the threat was turning into a coordinated operation. It became clear that the window to intervene was closing. The cooperating witness provided the final confirmation. The Phantoms considered the plan ready. Roles were assigned, and MT had approved moving forward. At that point, the operation was no longer speculative. It was expected to begin soon. The 3-phase massacre plan. After the 2013 killing, the conversations inside the Phantoms gradually shifted from broad talk about retaliation to a structured outline of what the group believed should come next. By the time investigators later reconstructed those discussions, it was clear the Phantoms weren't considering a single act of violence. They were forming a coordinated three-phase plan aimed at dismantling the Hell Lovers Motorcycle Club entirely. Phase 1 focused on killing several Hell Lovers members in Detroit. The individuals discussed were not selected for rank or leadership. The purpose was impact. In motorcycle club culture, a death inside a chapter almost always leads to a funeral, and funerals bring together officers, members, prospects, and associates from multiple locations. Phase 1 was designed to trigger that gathering. Phase 2 centered on the funeral itself. According to recorded conversations later obtained by investigators, the plan was to attack the Hell Lovers Detroit clubhouse during the funeral crowd, taking advantage of the predictable turnout. The intention was to strike the club at its most concentrated point and significantly weaken its ability to function. Phase 3 extended beyond Detroit. Evidence showed the Phantoms discussed sending teams to other cities where the Hell Lovers had active chapters. The objective was to prevent them from regrouping or organizing a response. If carried out, this phase would have expanded the violence across multiple jurisdictions, transforming the conflict from a local dispute into a multi-city offensive. Inside the Phantoms, these phases were reflected in the roles people began discussing. Surveillance runs, transportation plans, and secondary teams were mentioned in ways consistent with each stage of the outline. This was the moment when general anger hardened into coordinated action. What the Phantoms didn't know was that one of the men involved in these conversations was already cooperating with authorities. His recordings provided investigators with a clear timeline and a detailed understanding of the plan's structure. That information became a critical factor in the government's decision to intervene before any phase could be carried out. Plans continued to move forward until an unrelated act of violence forced federal agents to accelerate their response. The shooting confirmed what investigators had already heard on tape. The Phantoms weren't just talking about violence, they were preparing to initiate it. At that point, federal authorities no longer had the option to wait for more information. They had a narrow window, and the individuals preparing for Phase 1 had now shown they were willing to act sooner than expected. The shooting moved the investigation from observation to prevention. The objective was no longer to document a conspiracy, it was to stop a killing before it occurred. This shift turned the investigation into a race. The Phantoms weren't just planning anymore, they were preparing. And what came next made that clear. The turncoat. By the time the Phantoms were gearing up, federal agents already had a window into their internal conversations. Carl "Fats" Miller, whose cooperation had begun earlier, was still in the room, listening, asking questions, and quietly recording the discussions that mattered most. As preparations inside the clubhouse became more organized, Miller's recordings captured the details investigators needed: who was involved, what roles were being assigned, and how members expected the first phase to unfold. These conversations confirmed that the club was not talking loosely about retaliation. They were outlining steps meant to be carried out. Inside the Phantoms, nothing about Miller's presence seemed unusual. He was a chapter president, someone with standing, and a familiar participant in meetings. No one questioned him, sitting through planning sessions or weighing in on logistics. Trust inside a motorcycle club is built on time and proximity, and Miller had both. For investigators, his cooperation was the difference between monitoring a threat and understanding its structure. Without the information he provided, federal agents would have been operating with only fragments, scattered incidents, rumors, and patterns. With Miller, they had clarity. And that clarity made one thing undeniable: the Phantoms were moving toward action, not talk. With that realization, the investigation reached a turning point. The next step was no longer observation, it was an intervention. The raid. December 12, 2013, began like any other winter morning in Detroit. Quiet streets, shuttered storefronts, and a city still asleep. Nothing on the surface suggested that a major federal operation was about to unfold. Inside a federal command center, however, agents were already preparing to move. The recordings provided by Carl "Fats" Miller had given investigators the timeline they needed, and they concluded that waiting any longer risked allowing Phase 1 of the Phantom's plan to begin. With that determination, the raids were approved. Federal operations of this scale require precise coordination. ATF teams, FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and local law enforcement partners were assigned to multiple Phantom-linked locations, clubhouses, residences, and stash spots connected to members involved in the planning. The goal was to hit every site simultaneously, cutting off communication between members and minimizing the chance that anyone could escape or destroy evidence. Before dawn, unmarked vehicles spread across the city in quiet formation, positioning themselves for a coordinated entry. When the signal came, the operation unfolded quickly. Agents forced entry into the targeted locations tied to the Phantom Michigan chapters, the Detroit Mother chapter, the Inkster chapter, and the Pontiac chapter, issuing commands and securing occupants before most had time to react. Several Phantoms were taken into custody while still half asleep, unaware that the investigation had already reached its conclusion. Within minutes, the club's structure began to fracture. The men who had spent weeks preparing for a multi-step offensive now faced a coordinated federal response that came without warning. Inside the properties, agents recovered exactly what Miller's recordings had suggested: firearms, ammunition, tactical clothing, surveillance notes, and information tied to Hell Lovers locations. The discoveries confirmed that the Phantom's intentions were active, not speculative. Nothing found inside the clubhouses contradicted the cooperating witness. Instead, the evidence reinforced the scope and coordination prosecutors would later describe in court. The same hierarchical structure that made the Phantoms capable of planning large-scale violence also made them vulnerable to disruption. Once MT and the key organizers were in custody, the broader plan became impossible to carry out. Drivers had no orders. Shooters had no targets. The timeline investigators feared was suddenly dismantled. Federal teams also moved to locations associated with MT. Agents did not expect cooperation from him, nor did they need it. And by morning, MT was in federal custody along with several other central figures. Across the city, additional members were arrested in separate actions. Some were found asleep. Others attempted to make sense of the speed and precision of the raids as weapons, documents, and gear were seized around them. What hours earlier had been a developing plan now existed only as evidence in the hands of federal agents. Detroit woke that morning not to the aftermath of a biker gang massacre, but to news of a sweeping federal takedown. And the reason was straightforward. Investigators knew the timing because someone inside the Phantoms had chosen to break the code of silence. That decision stopped the plan before it began, and the consequences, inside the courts and inside biker culture, would follow. The trial. Once the arrests were made, the case moved from Detroit streets into the federal courtroom, where months of investigative work were laid out in detail. Prosecutors approached the trial with a clear objective: show that members and leaders of the Phantom Outlaw Motorcycle Club and individuals tied to the Vice Lords conspired to carry out violent retaliatory acts, including a structured three-phase plan to kill members of the Hell Lovers Motorcycle Club. A major pillar of the case was the cooperating witness. His recordings and testimony gave prosecutors an inside view of meetings, planning sessions, and internal conversations that would otherwise have remained hidden. The witness also explained the club's structure, coded language, and how specific members fit into the organization's hierarchy. This testimony was supported by physical evidence seized during the raids: firearms, ammunition, tactical gear, masks, surveillance notes, and documentation tied to Hell Lovers locations. According to the Department of Justice, these items directly aligned with the planning described in the recordings. Prosecutors argued that the combination of intent, preparation, and capability established the core of the racketeering conspiracy. The trial also highlighted why the Phantoms were more difficult to categorize than typical regional clubs. Key defendants, including Antonio M.T. Johnson and Marvin Chosen One Nicholson, held leadership roles in both the Phantoms and the Vice Lords. Prosecutors argued that this overlap created an organization capable of moving with more coordination and manpower than a traditional biker club, helping explain how the three-phase plan reached the scale it did. Multiple defendants were tried together under RICO conspiracy charges. In March 2015, a federal jury convicted 6 leaders and members of the Phantoms and Vice Lords of racketeering-related crimes, including conspiracy to commit murder in aid of racketeering, convicted in related proceedings before and after the main trial, with sentences ranging from several years to multiple decades. One of the most significant outcomes involved Marvin Nicholson, the national enforcer, who received a 40-year federal sentence. Prosecutors emphasized that Nicholson had fired at ATF agents during the execution of a search warrant, an action documented by both FBI and DOJ investigators. Antonio M.T. Johnson, identified as the national president of the Phantoms and a 3-star general within the Vice Lords, was later sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. The timeline of convictions began in December 2014, when the first wave of Phantom members entered guilty pleas or were found guilty on racketeering-related charges. During this phase, Brandon Page was convicted of conspiracy to murder in aid of racketeering and received a 90-month sentence. Roger Valdez, who later testified for the government, was convicted of assault with a dangerous weapon in aid of racketeering and a firearms offense, leading to a 49-month sentence. Raynard Brown, Vicente Phillips, and Morris Williams were each convicted of racketeering conspiracy, while Charles Davis was acquitted of all charges. The most significant outcomes came on March 16, 2015, when a federal jury returned significant RICO verdicts against 6 key leaders of the Phantom Outlaw Motorcycle Club and the Vice Lords. Antonio Mr. Tony Johnson, also known as MT or Big Bro, was convicted of RICO conspiracy, conspiracy to murder in aid of racketeering, and multiple weapons offenses. Marvin Chosen One Nicholson, the national enforcer, was convicted of similar racketeering and murder conspiracy charges, along with assaulting federal officers during the execution of a search warrant. Brian P.C. Sorrell was found guilty of RICO conspiracy, murder conspiracy, and weapons offenses. Sherman Tank Brown, the Detroit chapter's sergeant-at-arms, was convicted of conspiracy to murder in aid of racketeering. Brian Wood Jackson of the Inkster chapter was also convicted of murder conspiracy. In contrast, Matthew Arsenal Chamante, president of the Pontiac chapter, was convicted of RICO conspiracy and possession of an unregistered short-barrel shotgun. Additional convictions followed on May 27, 2015, when Christopher Murder Odom was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder in aid of racketeering, and William Daytona Frazier of the Pontiac chapter was convicted of 2 counts of assault with a dangerous weapon and 1 firearms offense. Prosecutors stressed that the case was grounded not in rumor, but in direct evidence, recorded conversations, seized weapons, surveillance notes, and cooperating witness accounts that matched the physical items recovered during the raids. For the jury, the trial did not introduce unexpected revelations. Instead, it confirmed what investigators already knew. The Phantoms had built a coordinated multi-step plan capable of causing mass casualties. In the end, the question was never whether the Phantoms could have carried out the plan. It was how close they came before federal agents stepped in. Once the verdicts were in, the case shifted from a near miss to a closed chapter. The 3-phase plot never reached the streets. The funerals never happened. And the multi-city attacks federal agents feared remained plans on paper, not scenes of violence. In court, the recordings, seized weapons, and cooperating witness testimony confirmed what investigators already knew. The Phantoms came closer to carrying out a coordinated attack than anyone outside the investigation ever realized. The collapse came only after the code of silence broke. Today, the figures who pushed the club toward that trajectory are serving long federal sentences, and the structure that made the plan possible no longer exists. The question was never whether the Phantoms were capable of the attack. It was how close they came before the law stepped in. And if you want to see how another leader rose even higher and fell even harder, Click on the next video to see how that story unfolds.